So I know that you're a cultural infidel,
Oh yeah, seriously, cultural infidel.
and I understand it um, from the vantage point of I'm a cultural infidel in certain areas, like music. I'm very sort of like past the 80s. I'm not too interested.
Mhm.
And even the 80s is a rough one for me, but looking back now through the decades, it's become more of a nostalgia thing, and I've learned to appreciate that time because I was like there at that time. But there something happened as it was. So, anyways, um, but I there's certain movies and series that I think that even though you haven't delved into them and haven't considered them because you have your there's some that I think are pretty neat that
Mhm.
I think you would appreciate, and there's examples of I did share one with you that you and your lady enjoyed. What
Oh,
was
oh yeah, that was Norseman.
yeah, and I'm surprised,
Mhm.
that you decided to delve into it,
Well,
and
it just the premise of the show sounded good to me. So I said, yeah, I'll check that out. I'll see what's, see what, and it's worth it. It's a Netflix series. They've got 2 seasons out. It's called Norseman. If you haven't seen it, I would certainly check it out. I highly recommend it. It's a good series. It really is.
so the one that I would recommend to you, although it's a bit so I don't want to I don't want to sort of like give you the negatives because knowing you already, you're not much into the gory stuff, right?
Yeah, not really, but
So I really love this series, although the gory stuff is pretty gory. It's called Santa Clarita Diet.
okay. I think I've heard of it. Mainly
It's
because Santa Clarita is where my stepsons used to live.
so Drew Barrymore,
Mm.
and the guy that she's married to. It's incredibly talented. I would the situation around it. There's 3 series. One just hit YouTube, not YouTube, Netflix just now today, and it's the third season. The premise of the show, in a nutshell, is you have Drew Barrymore as a mom of a teenage girl, and the husband. I forget his name. He's incredibly talented and funny. He uses facial expressions in such a imagine a bright lit world, but with a dark sort of like counterbalance in it. So she wakes up one day and she's totally wanting to eat humans, not in a exaggerated. Well, it is exaggerated, but not in the way you would assume that to go. It's very low key with extreme moments, and they're trying to live a normal life with that thing added to the mix, and it's just a wonderful. I think it's gotten really great reviews. I think it's one of those that you should check out at least a couple of episodes because you will like it.
I will look into it. I can't promise I'll watch it. See, first of all, I don't have Netflix. I know there are ways around that, but I don't advocate that kind of stuff. I will check into it, but I can't guarantee it. You know,
Well,
you know, I'm open to new stuff. I'll look at it and see
yeah,
what's what.
it's a definite it's one of those things that it's well done. So that's one that I think that you should check out. The other one that is fantastic is so I don't know, are you much into you like medieval and historical and this and that, but how about when it's nudged into the fantastical, sort of like
Well, it
ro
just it depends on the story, but if it's believable, if it's plausible, sure. I'm
so
open minded enough to check it out anyway.
so this one's epic. By the way, the Santa Clarita one is I think it's just incidentally, last thing about that, not to drag it on, but the Santa Clarita one, they're both realtors.
Oh, geez.
And imagine her with fits of hunger and they're showing houses off and they're walking through and it is an incredible sort of uh mixture of different situations in a normal world and they're also trying to act as normal as they. It's just, I don't want to say slapstick, but there's some sort of humor in there that I don't know what you would call it. You'd have to see to tell me.
Outrageously dark from all outward appearances, anyway.
Yeah, it's super funny. But the other one is Game of Thrones.
Okay, I've heard a lot. I've heard a ton about it. I haven't gotten into it at all.
Yeah.
I've seen bits and pieces of various episodes here and there, just little snips, but I haven't delved into it yet. That strikes me as one of those series that people get all consumed by. You know, kind of like Doctor Who or Star Trek. Pick any of the franchises. I mean, people become all consumed with it. And
Yeah.
I know my personality, I would be right along with it. So I tend to kind of shy away from things like that. But you never know.
Well, that one is very, very well made in that you have the surroundings of this world, and you have these families. It's kind of like the kings of old and the royal lines that we like to look into historically, but
Right.
nudged into a world that's fantasy. And there's these families, and they're interlaced. Sort of, it's just they're trying to all get on top, and there's things that are in their way, and it's just a vast universe of well written dialogue. Just the video or whatever, the yeah,
Mm.
the
Yeah.
video is very well done, the effects are done, and it's lower keyed as far as the extravagance of overcoming your objections of believing in the story,
Mhm.
because they do it in such a way where dialogue is premier.
Right.
It's just very well done. So
Now,
I recommend it.
how many seasons have they done?
I think that they're about 8 seasons.
Yeah, is it that much? Okay.
It's
Okay.
massive.
Okay. Yeah, I know it'd been around for a while, and like I say, I've heard a lot about it, but I've not delved into it yet. Like I said, I've been somewhat reluctant to. But yeah, you know, I'll maybe I need to pay a little bit more attention to some things. But
There's a family. Last thing I'll say about this: there's a family, and one of the sons and these are this is like a family, a line, right? And they're all trying to conquer each other, but they're friends at the same time, and subtleties, and it's a vast ocean of, well, one of their sons for this one family was born a dwarf, and he's an American actor, and to compensate for his stature in this world of men and giants and all this, you would think that he's a weakling and this and that, but his mind is incredibly developed, where he can scheme and plot and nudge people all around the universe that this is built on, and some interesting things occur. So very brilliant writing.
so like an evil genius kind of a thing.
Yeah, he's well. See, that's also the other thing. They're not evil, and they're not. Each character they present you like their side of the story in a way where you start to like them,
Mhm.
but then they do this horrible thing to this other group of people, and then it involves you in that story, and then you see, well, these people are horrible, but wait a second, and then they have good qualities, and it's a very complicated. They're very. I would give it like 10 stars on a scale of 1 to 10 of quality. Just amazing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people raving about it, really getting hot and heavy into it, and that's one of the reasons I've been so hesitant to jump into it, is because it seems to be all consuming. You know,
Yeah.
but if they've got 8 seasons, I might have to go check it out.
Yeah.
You know,
You'll,
that was my only complaint about Norseman, was that I discovered it right at the end of season 1, just before season 2 was beginning to be released. And now everybody's on pins and needles waiting on season 3. And so far as I know, it's in production now.
yeah.
But, you know, season 3 of Norseman was left with a huge cliffhanger, and well, a couple of them. And you're like, come on, you guys, you knew this was going to happen. Start writing, you know?
One thing that's happened with the new way that we watch movies and TV and consume, content. And by the way, we call it content now, kind
Yeah.
of, sort of, but we used to not even consider these things because we were so removed from the process. We were just people viewing TV shows and all that prior to the internet. Well, one thing that's occurred is that now you can have bulk episodes that you can binge watch and sort of finish a series, and you kind of catch up to the writers and filmmakers, so that you have to wait this amount of time. And by the time the next season comes, you watched all this stuff, but you consumed it in lightning, speed. So you kind of have to, sometimes you're like, well, where were we? What was
Yeah.
happening now in season two? Why is the, and you have to sort of maybe go back. That's kind of a new sort of thing. Before, we used to watch one episode, wait a week, and
Yep.
then Happy Days, the next one is, you know what I'm saying? And
Oh yeah. Yeah. The fact they even came up with a word, a phrase to describe it now. They call it appointment television.
oh
But
wow,
that's the way it always was. I mean, they made, I'm probably going to get this wrong. They made like 13 episodes a year, maybe a little bit more. And they followed the old theater format where the new season would start in autumn and the new season would run all through autumn into winter. Then you were left with a little cliffhanger there. Then they would repeat the season up until June. And then you would either have repeats or you would have replacement shows during the summer. And that followed the old theater format when it was just plain and simply too hot to play in theaters during the summer.
yeah.
So the, stage companies would, put everything away, and that's when they would write new scripts and do new acts and what have you, get everything ready to go. Then they'd go out on the road again in August or September. But well, September, October, actually, around in there. But anyhow, but yeah, they would make a certain number of episodes, and you would watch each episode week by week. You knew you could pick it up in reruns if you missed one, but you tried like crazy if you had a favorite show not to miss that show. Because if you missed it, that was it. It was gone.
You
And if
had to
it
be.
was, yeah, and if it was a serialized episodic adventure that you're watching, and you miss one show, well, how the hell did we get here? Well, we missed that one. Okay, well, I'm going to have to find it and rerun,
It
pick
was
it up and rerun.
haphazard.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Yeah.
really haphazard back then because, I mean, the theme and characters were there. You missed a
Mm-hmm.
few episodes and you're like, okay, but we were limited in that respect. And yet it was, like we've said before, a coming together of families
Mm-hmm.
in the evenings and so on and or friends, if you're watching it.
Right.
And that was, there's something quaint, although it wasn't considered quaint. It was considered just, it is what it is. But now looking back at it, doesn't it, I wouldn't trade this for anything really. But
Well,
looking
now,
back,
yeah.
right?
Now, yeah, but I mean, back then we just didn't know any other way. And in fact, the first time I can remember any, if a new season of anything came out, they just dumped the entire season and didn't make you wait a week for the next episode, because that was the whole point, is to make you wait a week and bring you back for the next episode. So they would, do little things. They weren't all serialized episodic shows. I mean, a lot of those shows, in fact, almost all the sitcoms, there were very few exceptions to that. And most of the dramas, as I'm thinking about it, were not episodic, meaning you could miss a couple and you wouldn't miss anything. They didn't have to be watched in order. There were a few exceptions. Like there was a sitcom called Soap that was a spoof of soap operas. And it was a after prime time TV show on ABC that, because of the subject matter, they talked about things that weren't considered appropriate for family hours, But very funny show. But it was episodic and serialized. So you did need to start from number one and progress because the story continued. but most of them weren't that way. So if you missed one, you didn't really miss anything chronological. But the Discovery Channel was the first one that I can remember doing that, where I want to say it was either Deadliest Catch or Dirty Jobs. It was one of those two. The new season premieres on this day on Discovery, and they played it for the whole day. Every episode of the new season played in one day. And I thought, well, that was dumb. What's to get you to come back next week?
So
Not
they
fully
kept you.
realizing, yeah, not fully realizing that they had another new series next week. So you were just, they wanted to get you in that time slot for the whole day. They didn't want you changing the channel, and evidently it worked because we've gotten used to it.
There's
But
also. Oh, go ahead.
but they took that from the old serials that they used to play in the movie theaters, trying to get you to come back every Saturday. Because, you have episode 1 of Flash Gordon. You got to see what happens in episode 2. So,
Yeah.
And there were like 12 or 13 episode series. So they tried to get you in for that entire 12 or 13 weeks that they had the episodes for.
Well, I was gonna say that. So now, sort of like juxtaposed with all that from back then, which is what we knew. Now we have all the things that we know. There's these channels, and I kind of, in my mind, categorize. I guess it's based on your personal interests and stuff, but there's these certain channels that are focused on uh, telling stories about things in the world as they occurred. Um, it'll be a guy or a gal, and they'll put information together with photos and whatnot. We see a lot of this. I'll give you an example. There's a channel called Defunctland, or Defunctland, or Offhand Disney,
Mm-hmm.
which Doc introduced me to, and I've been enjoying those little sort of, because what they'll do is, like with Defunctland or Offhand Disney, it's one guy that, very well done, probably zero budget, um, thousands, hundreds of thousands of views, if not millions. Definitely in some cases, and some videos, millions. And he'll go and explain the haunted house or the haunted manor, from its beginnings all the way through. But he'll take you through the park, and they create a little world time capsule that he goes back into and gives you all the information that you would have not known or picked up on back in the day. And I think that those are very cool channels. I've been digging that a lot.
So he'll like take one attraction at Disneyland and just kind of pick it apart, put it back together, and give the whole timeline on it.
Yeah, what happened? Why did it close down in the case of like certain attractions?
Oh,
And
okay.
what replaced it? How did it come about? Who were the people that prepared it? What are some of the little Easter eggs inside? Because there's lots of Easter eggs
Oh
with the
yeah.
Disney theme, and he'll take you through with either footage that he goes to the park and films, next to um, footage from the past, and he does it really well. I mean, it's real. We tried one time, and we've got others to come in the future. Hopefully, we did a documentary on the 30th anniversary of Led Zeppelin's first
Oh, the 50th.
album.
The 50th anniversary.
Oh, it was 50.
It was the 50th anniversary of the formation of Led Zeppelin. We did that back in January. It's on our YouTube channel here.
Yeah.
And had a lot of fun doing that. We need to do more of those.
Yeah, it's it's a little bit more involved, right?
Oh yeah, it was a little bit intense there for a little bit, but it was a lot of fun to get done. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And folks seem to enjoy it.
Yeah, I like that sort of thing, recounting and stuff. And so there's these channels that are occurring that do that, and then you have channels that, like what we do, generally speaking, which is we create a thing, or tutorials, taking people through certain software or processes concerning woodworking or making in general, products and all that. All the things that we know. You can't really sort of like put it all back in the bottle. This is, I would say the best case scenario as far as we know,
Yeah.
as far as entertainment, and
Well,
we're involved.
I certainly like documentaries. I'm a big fan of them. To me, they are entertainment. It's not just, well, this suit of armor was worn by this guy. And it's not just things like that. I mean, it's the telling of history. It's the telling of who we are, where we came from. And, learning medieval history did lead to us, because when you stop and think about it, we are the descendants of the survivors of that.
Yeah,
So a lot of all of the intrigue that went on, both, political as well as religious versus just interpersonal, this family against that family and what have you. That stuff has always interested me. And I also just like to see how things are made, how things are done, and just where people and things come from,
I'm
as
with you on
well
that.
as stories about places. I've always been a real fan of that.
Yeah, I'm like that's exactly it for me. I watched two different. Well, I've watched a lot. I love consuming information and stuff, and I guess it's always within the scope of what we're interested and wanting to view. Because you could go anywhere, right? With the
Mhm.
internet now, we could learn about, I don't know, omelet variations in, I don't know, Angola, or space astronaut sort of like button badges from the 1960s and who collects them. Or I just, you know what I'm saying? It's like whatever and anything. But
Yeah.
I watched a couple of one is extensive, and I know that you've got a lot of information on that one, maybe on both. And I guess I'll tell you, one was the voyage of Christopher Columbus. It's like a complete documentary, but from the lens of people in Spain, um, recreating the actual ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria,
Right.
and they actually go. Obviously, there's books and all that, but it's so great to see they build them and they sail them towards the Caribbean, and they also on par jot the course as best they can because it's not perfect.
Right.
But they jot the course, and it's just when they. This is probably the only thing I'll say about that. It's just an amazing adventure. There's a lot to be said, but when the Spaniards in the south were building one of their ships and they had it ready, I think it was either the Pinta or the Santa Maria was done further up north. This is like current time, like they're
Right.
rebuilding the actual recreation. Well, it's a funny thing because they can build it, but we now use modernized instrumentation, navigation equipment, and engines, and and all these things. And there are sailboats, but they're small. I mean, you don't
Sure.
find these huge sailing ships nowadays.
Right.
And there's a limited amount of people that know how to do that. It takes a crew. The Spaniards got ready to take off with that one ship, and it's not even the biggest ship. The Santa Maria was the biggest ship. They're getting ready to take off, and the captain, he's like a captain,
Mhm.
but he's not a. Nobody knows about the sails and the proper and the way it's done and the shape of the ship. It's its own unique sort of like thing.
Right.
They couldn't get it out of the initial. Couldn't align it right to get out of the harbor, and they're like they couldn't do it, and they were trying all they could and stuff. They were just not practiced. The people from back in the day, they had that knowledge and that custom.
Mhm.
They needed a tugboat to push them out,
Wow.
and once they were out, they were fine.
Mhm.
But
Well, yeah, they had room to maneuver, but yeah, there's not a Spanish galleon school that I can think of around here anymore. So
yeah,
basically, they had a whole crew, to include the captain, full of student drivers
yeah, it
trying
was
to get it out of the slip. Wow, wow.
another bit about that sort of that episode. I think it was really an incredible thing, just the whole journey and stuff. It wasn't just Christopher Columbus. Obviously, they had men. I mean, just left sailors. But on one of the ships, towards the, I guess, southern part of Spain, they hired a guy, a Spaniard guy, and he was well versed in this and that. Well, in that area of Spain, I don't know about the rest of it, but in that area, they don't praise Christopher Columbus. In fact, they feel that Christopher Columbus took the glory from this one guy that we don't even know about. He's got a name that starts with a P. But that one guy is like they have celebrations every year. The descendants of his family, which are numerous because it's like 400 or 500 years ago or whatever.
It wasn't Amerigo Vespucci, was it?
Oh, that's another thing they talked about. America, we're in America.
Right.
Well, um, Columbus um, was sentenced, and he then was later freed. But he committed, a lot of atrocities and stuff, and they were so pissed at him, and the fact that he had not found enough gold at during his voyages, that they named the New World after America
Hmm.
and not Columbus. So this would have been Columbia's or the
Hmm.
Columbias or something to that effect.
Hmm.
And it didn't end up that way because that guy sailed after Columbus. So
Right.
after Columbus opened the door, the passage to the New World, everybody was able to do it
Right.
easier because it was something that was unheard of before. Yeah, it was just so
Yeah.
he didn't take any of that glory. The people in that area of Spain, they don't celebrate Columbus. They celebrate um, that one guy that sailed in the boat with him,
Oh,
like
okay.
in one of
Okay.
the three boats at the time. But they said if it, not for him, Columbus wouldn't have done jack squat.
Hmm.
And so there's regional,
Yeah.
something that I didn't even consider. There's regional even within Spain and the whole thing. It's just
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that.
you
So
have to see that it's a very interesting. It's like an hour and 45 minute documentary.
I'll check it out. I'll check it out.
The one that you should that well, it's an overview, but it's deep and yet overview and hard to. You have to see it a few times.
Hmm.
It's a 4.5 hour extravaganza.
Uh-oh.
It is the kings and queens of England
Okay. How?
from the beginning, from the be, from the be, from when they were, you know, little states, little separate
Yeah.
little, all the way through to the current monarchy.
Okay. So they get into like Ethelred and Alfred and all the rest of them back then in the day. William the
Based,
Conqueror and all of them. Okay.
yes, which is amazing when you watch it, and they'll bring up a timeline. It's an old documentary, but they'll bring up like a little graph with a timeline, and you can see the reason that these things are important, and I don't know about the listeners, but I find it fascinating because it's what you said earlier, how things began, how we connect to things. It's just an amazing saga, and it's dirty. When you look back on it from our vantage point now, as we've been taught, the timelines seem to flow in a way, but human beings' lives are not polished at whatsoever. And there was betrayal and
Oh yeah.
murder and assassinations and lynch and burning and head
Oh yeah.
choppers, everything.
Oh yeah. Go back and look at the De Medicis. I mean, go anywhere in continental Europe for that matter. I mean, and that's what I mean when I say that's where we came from. So the history of Spain is just as important as the history of what became Germany or France or any of the eastern states, Estonia or Latvia or anything like that. The history of those made us what we are. So yeah, it's important. I mean, now I tend to focus on the history of the areas that my direct ancestors came from. So in tracing back and what have you and figuring those things out. I like, for instance, I know more about the area around the Texas Louisiana border now than I ever have in my life, but only because that's where my grandmother is from. That's what area they were originated. So it was just it's something that draws me in and draws me back to search those areas. And so I know a little bit about Scotland, a little bit about Ireland, a little bit about the UK, or England, if you will. And it's basically in figuring out who those people were to figure out who I am and where I am. But yeah, you're absolutely right. European history is, there wouldn't be American history without it.
One of the things that is shocking and about that whole, British historical thing is that at one point, and see, the thing is that there's so much, because we're talking over 1,000 years and more, thousands of years, and antiquity. You know how they say the ancients? It's like from Christ back, right? From Christ's death on the cross back is considered antiquity. From that point on, it's current, events.
Right.
Current events is a mouthful, because we're talking thousands of years as well. But the thing that shocks me about the English thing is that in that documentary at one point they say, and this was truly the last, you might know who he is, the last official true English monarch. And it was at the beginning, because from that point, people from France, Germanics,
Right.
became the royal, or the lineage, and even the lineage was severed. You'd have a guy that took over, and he was like accepted as and then he'd have a son, and then he'd be murdered, his son be murdered, then his cousin would come in to replace it, and it would just jotting back and forth. So it's not a clean,
No, it never was. It never was. And again, that's because history is written by the victors and the survivors. So they can pretty much say whatever they want on how they took over. The folks around them know, but yeah, there was nothing clean about it. I mean, it was all, gosh, I'm showing my ignorance now, and there's obviously listeners and probably people in the chat here live on YouTube who know this. I'm trying to remember who the first king of England, Scotland, Wales was that united basically all of that island. I don't remember who it was.
Was it one of the Henrys?
I know it was before that. But
there was one that when that king in England died or got chopped his head off or was pushed out or something. There was a guy in Scotland from Edinburgh that came down to take over, England, and by doing so, because he was a monarch over there, by doing so, he united the Scots and England, and it highlights the whole map. But then something happened to him. I mean, it was such a mess.
Yeah, that was a mess for several hundred years. And I mean, we like to think we're in civilized times now, but a lot of the relationships over there are still, relatively speaking, still a little delicate, let's say. When you have, and that's why a lot of people will still say that America isn't old enough to have a culture. When you're talking about 1,000 years of monarchy over there, something that happened a couple of hundred years ago, you're only talking about the last quarter of this entity's existence. You know what I mean? So yeah, the people don't forget easily. I'll put it to you that way.
I will tell you one thing though, to that point of America being so young, young, relatively speaking, depending on what one is, because we have things here that from 1492 on, we have St. Augustine here in Florida, the northern edge of Florida, bordering Georgia just about. We have St. Augustine. There's very old places, and in the 1600s, you have places popping up. Boston, we talked about that, I think, one point, and all that. And so And those people didn't just pop. We didn't just pop up.
Right.
We actually are,
Right. But
from.
but as a nation, we're still pretty young, and there are a lot of people out there who still think that America is still, because if you want to put it in the context, compare it to Chinese culture. I mean, they go back into prehistory,
Yeah,
and it's like, well, your country is only 200 years old. You're not old enough to have a culture. We have a culture. It's like, okay, fair point. Compared to you, no, we don't have much of anything. But we do have a separate and distinct culture. There is a separate and distinct culture here, and it's made up of all the occult, all of the cultures that have come here.
totally. I totally see it and agree. Well, obviously, I see it because we're here.
Mhm.
Even though it's young, you have a huge cake that's being baked, and
Oh yeah,
constantly, it's lifting up, and just and it's all about a little bit from here, a little bit from there, regional differences. And there's a difference too, in that a lot of people don't consider that America, or the U.S., let's say,
mhm.
the U.S. is a huge. You take the U.S. and you just plop it
Yeah,
up in size next to Europe, and see how that works. And we have people spread throughout the country.
yeah. And well, and that's one of the fun things. I have discussions with folks over in the UK about things like this. They don't realize, they don't get that the US has different regions, and okay, to relate it to the UK, where I'm at in Oregon is as different from you in Miami as Edinburgh is from Wales. Pick
Even
a, pick
more.
a city in Wales. It's even more different than that,
Yeah,
because of the influences, the different waves of immigrants that came out here. We have a lot of Hispanics who have come up from South and Central America. You know, um, some that were here before us, some that came quite after. We also have a large German population for some reason in this area here in Southern Oregon. You get back east in the Northeast, it's a mixture of German and Dutch up in there. The Southeast, you have the the Scottish, the Irish, and the Scotch Irish. And each one of these regions, because of the resources that they had available to them, the food in the South is completely different from the food in the Pacific Northwest,
yeah.
which is completely different from the Southwest, which is completely different from up around the Great Lakes, because different things grew in different regions. And so it's completely it's completely regional. So when they say, well, American food, this, well, yes and no, but it all came from somewhere else anyway. So, it
Well,
doesn't
that's,
really matter.
yes, yeah. Take that exact thing with food as an example, a small example, and not to belittle the fact that yes, it's a small, or it's a young culture, uh,
Mhm.
in some ways, like we've been mentioning. But just taking an example of not even mentioning the language, how even though there's variations, it's all wrapped up in an American identity. Um, so you can differentiate someone from the New England area,
Mhm.
or from the South,
Mhm.
or Midwest. There's different, there's differences, but there's, oh, that's American. It's just regional, this and
Yeah.
that. It's a vast area. We're talking about 3,000 miles east to west. That's
Mhm.
a lot. But food, you'll have the Italians.
Uh-huh.
Heck, you'll have with the Italian food, but it's sort of Americanized. Or you'll have the Mexicans. Think about the Mexican, or
Oh,
what we do here as far as Mexican food. It's not Mexican food.
yeah.
It's a variant of it, and it
Right.
becomes completely this.
Yeah.
So, and that's just a small example. We
Oh,
are
yeah.
fairly young, but we came from somewhere back there in the old world,
Right.
and all these traditions collided as they. But you know what? I I think that the binding is actually we take our laws from Anglo-Saxon tradition in America very closely. We
Yeah.
do have differences that came about in the 1700s, as we all know, but those are the differences that make America very unique. You know, which we don't have to get into, but there's a whole host of things, guns and all that.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things like that. But just in sticking with the concept of food, I mean, we take an idea from somebody else, and Americans are very, very good at ramping it up. You know, look at barbecue. Look at the variations in the different types. I mean, you take just a piece of beef
Yeah,
and you give it to someone from Texas, someone from Kansas City, someone from North Carolina, someone from South Carolina, and someone from pick somewhere in the Midwest.
no, go into
Illinois,
Florida.
go into Florida,
You know how different.
every one of them has a different way of cooking. It's all over an open fire. It's all over coals. But the way they season things, the way the length of time they cook it, you'll have completely different dishes all off of that same piece of meat. And Americans have become really, really good at that. We'll take an idea and go, man, we like that. Let's see what we can do with it. You know, now sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. I think a lot of the traditional stuff.
Supersize it, will you?
That's the other one. That's the other problem is, you know, yeah, we do like our portions, and I don't know. That's to our detriment. But then again, it's not like there are no fat people anywhere else in the world. I mean, come on.
Well, you know what?
So
The invention of, I want to say that the biggest contribution to mankind up to this point in time is not the wheel, is not the light bulb, it's not even like the telephone or the computer. It's the McDonald's Super Size Me value meal.
actually, I think I would argue with that. I think it's the microwave oven.
Okay.
I think it's the microwave oven.
I'm joking.
You know, you no longer have to wait a half an hour for pizza rolls. Throw them in the oven and lift the foil to expose this. You can have them in 2.5 minutes and say, you know what, that was good. I think I'll have a few more. You know, and you know, you and I both know people that'll do that. You know?
Oh yeah.
You know, they get lean cuisine. Oh, I'm going to eat healthy. I'm going to get lean cuisine, the small diet dishes. Well,
Yeah.
4 or 5 of them and you're set. Yeah.
That's exactly it. You know what's funny about that? Whenever I go to the shopping mall, and the shopping mall, look at the shopping mall. When I go to the shopping mall, when I go to the supermarket, and I see that lean cuisine or whatever equivalent of it, and it's like a little box like that with one little wrap thing or whatever, and I'm like, boy, I'd sure like to try that, but it's gonna take like 4 or 5 of those.
Yeah, we've become experts at consumption, and not always to our benefit. That's for certain. But I mean, that's what I mean when I say that we're spoiled, because we live in a society where we can get up at 2:30 in the morning, and if we want a pizza, we can go get a pizza.
Oh yeah.
Or on a Sunday. You know,
Yeah.
there are 24-hour places that will deliver, so you don't even have to get dressed and go out and be around people. You know, we make it too easy on ourselves. So that's why I say that we're spoiled. We've never had to really wonder where our next meal is coming from. All we've had to wonder is, what am I going to have to drink with it?
You know, it's funny talking about that around the clock thing. In my area, I can tell you we have 1, 2, 3, 4, like 4 or 5, depending on Walmarts in my area. And we're talking within a span of 10 miles, right? We're not talking like next to each other. But there's, out of all those that I'm aware of, there's 2 that are open 24 hours. The other ones end at midnight or whatnot. How about you?
There are 3 in this county of 200,000 people, and one of them is open 24 hours. The other 2 close at midnight. It's a small town. But even saying that, you can not only get up at 3:30 in the morning on a Sunday, and go get fast food, you can go sit down in a restaurant and have a full meal. You know,
Hmm.
there is a definite culture around that, around eating late or getting it whenever you want it. And a lot of people will try to defend it in the, well, some people have odd hours and they work graveyard shift or they work this odd shift and they'll get off at 2 in the morning and they want to go get something to eat. And that's true. I've been there. I've done that. I mean, I've done the graveyard shift. I've worked late swing, got off at 3 in the morning myself.
Hmm.
But I would say 99% of the people you see in Waffle House at 3 in the morning are on their way home from not work, or they just left home and wanted
Yeah.
a pecan waffle. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, you'll be restless in bed, turning and
Mhm.
like, pecan waffle, and you'll get up and you get in that car and you'll haul butt to the IHOP and you're done.
Many's the night I've dreamt of scattered, smothered, covered, and chunked. So the right people will get that. And here I am in the Pacific Northwest, and the closest Waffle House is in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm going to have to go to Arizona, I guess.
But you do have IHOPs, right?
Not in this town. They closed it. They
Oh
weren't getting
wow.
enough business. There's talk about one coming back, but we'll
Do you
see.
have little diner like breakfast diners and stuff?
Oh yeah, we have a bunch of little smaller regional ones, and a
De-
couple of big national chains.
Denny's.
Yeah, we have Denny's, which I'm not much for. I'm not a fan of, but a lot of smaller regional places. Apple Peddler, things like that. They just got real excited about 4 months ago. Medford, we finally got a Cracker Barrel. Yeehaw!
That's awesome.
Yeah, we haven't been in it yet because the lines are too long.
Um,
So
I think this is a French thing, but fondue. There's a place called the melting pot. Have you heard of that company before?
the melting pot?
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
So we have a store or a restaurant in Miami, and it's like a fondue thing.
Oh, okay.
And so you go there, and they bring like a little cast iron
Hmm.
um, cauldron. I don't know what you call it,
Yeah.
and they put it there with boiling oil, and then you have your skewers, and they'll bring you a tray of raw meats and fish, and you
Mm.
just skewer it, put it in. The whole family can join in and fun, and then they do the same with like desserts and all that, and that's your day. I mean, just so many different little things.
That's amazing because that came and went in the late 60s and early 70s on the West Coast. Everybody was into fondue.
Hmm.
Everybody. And you had a couple of those little, I mean, that you could go down to Sears or Montgomery Ward's or whatever store you wanted to and get fondue sets. And they had the little stand that you put the pot
Hmm.
on over sterno or whatever, and the little special forks and what have you. Then people would set up, this one here has oil in it, and this one here has cheese in it, and this one over here for dessert, it's got melted chocolate in it.
That's
And now they got
exactly
the
it.
chocolate fountain thing. Now they have the chocolate fountain thing where
Freaking awesome.
it pumps melted chocolate up the center, and it kind of cascades out in a fountain thing. And you take your marshmallow and dip it in the fountain and
Good
have
stuff,
chocolate
man.
covered marshmallows. Okay, fine. but,
Hey, I'm
but
not
yeah,
opposed to that. Isn't
but
that
boy,
like a s'mores or something?
yeah, similar. Throw it on a graham cracker and you're good. But I haven't thought of fondue since, oh my gosh, we're going way back because we're talking, like I said, the 60s and 70s. The
Gee.
late 60s. I think fondue went out on the West Coast in like 73, 74, something like that.
Boy, Mark, who was king during that time? Whose heads were being chopped off then?
Oh man. Yeah. Oh, in the
See,
70s, it was Queen Elizabeth.
right, yeah.
And
She
that
took over.
brings up a point. I don't remember which comedian that says it, but you had like William the Conqueror, you
That's right.
know. How come it's not Elizabeth the German? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
You always had they had the name, Richard the Lionhearted and William the Conqueror. Why did they stop doing that?
It's a little bit more exciting, right, to hear it like
Yeah,
that.
it is. It is.
I do want to say one final thing about that whole thing with England and Europe and all that. So I also like to. So I'll be watching the documentary, but they'll start mentioning like places,
Hmm.
and I'll go and I'll pause the documentary and I'll go to Google Earth,
Hmm.
and I went into England and I went right into London, right, and to explore a house that one of the sons of the king at the time, I forget who, because it's just a huge history, was living at while waiting for his king to bite the big one, right?
Yeah.
And so that he would take over and this and that. Um, but then I looked at the Thames,
Hmm.
the river, and then my mind went and where? So the river begins here, off towards the east coast, between them and France, let's say. But where does it go on the other end? And I
Actually,
went,
yeah, actually that's backwards, but yeah, the mouth of it is there on the
well, yeah,
coast. But
it goes out into, right.
yeah,
It goes out into
right.
that sea or
Yeah,
ocean. I don't know what you
the
call it
English
between
Channel.
the English Channel. Is that what it
Yeah,
is?
yeah, that's the English Channel.
So, but where does it go in the opposite direction, heading
Right.
east? And so I decided to follow it. And I went, and boy, I was surprised. I didn't know it was. I thought it was going to go shooting straight out towards the east coast. And I followed that sucker up and down,
Oh
snaking through
yeah.
areas, and the amount of buildings and houses. And further you got away from London, it kept going. Then you get into the countryside. Well, I finally ended up where the Thames becomes a trickle
Hmm.
in a open farming field,
Hmm.
and it just sort of tapers off. It almost feels like it goes into the grass and it just ends.
Hmm.
And I looked at that area and I dropped the little guy from Google Earth into the road right adjacent to it just to see what that area, the area
Hmm.
where the Thames ends, I guess, looks like.
Hmm.
And I dropped in, and then there was this little bed and breakfast thing called like the Inn at the Thames or the Thames End, or I forget what it was, on that solitary road. And I ended up exploring that, going into that and looking at their on Google. You could go in and you could see like the inside of the establishment. You could see what they serve. I mean, the
Yeah.
sandwiches they serve, and I saw the people sitting out there under the awning, the wooden, and, and the rooms, little bedroom breakfast, and you would never end up there if not for curiosity, is what I'm
Right.
saying.
Exactly. And that's, you mentioned something that Americans have absolutely no concept of. I mean, we can do it as a young country, we can do it to a certain point. But you were talking about looking for the home of the son of one of these kings. But you look back and you think about these stories of things that happen in 1072 or 1156 or something like that. Chances are that building is still standing. And you can go, like you said, on Google Earth and you can see that building and see how, where it is in relationship to something else. There was a series on the great castles of England where they talked about Stirling Castle. It's up in, which is up in Scotland actually, but Dover and oh my gosh, what were the others? I can't remember them all. There were so many. It was fascinating stuff because it not only talked about the castle itself, but the surrounding area, the towns, and the people along the way. There's another documentary series, if you're interested in that kind of thing, by Sir Tony Robinson called Walking Through History.
I've
And
seen a few episodes.
that is a fascinating series to me. I mean, obviously, he did also The Time Team, which was a great series as well. But in Walking Through History, he actually takes a walking tour through this area from point A to point B. And it may take a couple, 3 days for him to do it. But he talks about the sights and the people along the way. And that's just fascinating stuff to me.
Yeah, I love that. You know, another thing that sort of like impressed itself by watching the saga from the beginning. And by the way, it's not an exhaustive explanation of everything. They
Right.
only surface explain how they got into power, a few of the political situations of those kings during that time period, and then they're passing away and passing on the title. And then that's how they got it within 4.5 hours. Because if you were to open up the whole thing, it's just impossible. It would be never ending
Yeah, you couldn't do it. I mean, there were some individuals you could do 6, 8, 10 hours on,
alone.
alone. Sure. I mean, there's no way to encapsulate 1,000 years of history into anything that somebody could sit down in one viewing and watch. There's just no way it could be done.
So
But
the impression that I got from that, aside, of watching that, was that although the monarchs were families from all around Europe,
mhm,
be it Spain, Germany, France, and taking turns, as it were, um, depending on who passed away and whatnot, taking turns controlling England, the people of England that lived there were always there throughout all that. Even though their monarchs would be
mhm.
from other, they were always quite, you know, British. And I'm
Eh,
talking England because
yeah.
that's kind of the seat, but we had people from Scotland and all that. We have all that, but this documentary was talking about how they consolidated power and the families. But you see what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
they were quite British always. In their own regions, they maintained the timeline where these monarchs were coming in from all different places.
Well, the average person just lives from day to day because that's all you can do.
Yeah,
And it doesn't really matter. Well, it does, but they're powerless to do anything about who happens to be in charge today or how we came to power. All they know is that I've got to go out and take care of these animals or go out and find these animals because they're missing, or what have you, and just living from day to day. So, yeah, I mean, but then again, the story of the monarchs is still the story of us because they decided directly and indirectly, they had direct effect on lived, who
yeah.
lived where, why they lived there, how they lived there, and if they didn't want you there, where you went to, you know.
The opposite was true. Another point that they made in this documentary was that if a monarch was not accepted by the people, if they didn't want to be governed by them, yes, there was butchering left and right,
Mhm.
but the pressures from that, because early on there was a, a certain king that agreed because he was foreign. He
Mhm.
was from probably Germany. I don't. He had the right to the title according to their whole thing, but he vowed to the people from that point on that there would be I forget who he was, but that he would maintain the laws and standards that they had always grown to know, like their regional ideologies, their cultural would not be disturbed. There was sort of like an agreement, and the
Mhm.
documentary makes a point of explaining that unlike all the other monarchs of Europe, in England, at the end of the day, the monarch had to have the consent of the governed to function because of the system that they introduced of
Mhm.
lawmakers surrounding the throne, as it were. So there were tiers of power. It wasn't like, say, in Spain, where it was final word, or Germany, final word, and so on, Russia, and so on.
Well, you're talking about the Magna Carta from 1215.
Okay, was that the moment?
Yes, it basically that was the moment, and we're talking about 1215 when you think about that, and that really did limit the powers of the king, of the sovereign. To It wasn't just he could do whatever he wanted. I mean, there were some checks and balances put into place.
Right, and that little helped.
Yeah, well,
Something.
yeah. I mean, it protected the citizenry as well as protected the sovereign. So, you know, but that's yeah. I mean, it was, and that actually formed the basis of our government when the Constitution was finally ratified in 1789. We took
Yep.
some of the ideas from that. We took a few other ideas from other areas because, I mean, no system is perfect. All systems are rife to are open to abuse, um, because somebody's always going to find a loophole. But so far, it's the best system that we've come up with, and you know, it's not such a bad thing. But you know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there has to be a check and a balance somewhere. Otherwise, you end up with a Idi Amin.
I was thinking too in that you're talking about. So back then, if you were a land owner or connected royal to the to the lines, and you had this well, you were rich and had well, you had money, you had food, you had the peasantry, I guess you'd call it, the common people, I guess you'd call it, and maybe they weren't so lucky for the next meal, depending on whatever situation, or clothing, or shelter, or whatever. And things in the Middle Ages, anyhow, became more sort of like towards the country as opposed to big cities. There was so much war and all these things. Um, Back then, I guess, like we've talked about this, it would be quite advantageous if you're born, I don't know, son to the Duke of this and Duchess of that. And I guess it would be today in modern time too, to a certain degree. But in no time in history in the past, that I can look at it, it's been said before. Does so many people, or do so many people have such high standards of living
Yeah.
than this time that we live in? Whether you're a commoner looking back at that, in fact, those roles, it's almost pretentious and even not even a concern with the advent of these powerhouse companies that come up, or individuals inventing some simple magnetic whatever or tool, or they become quite as powerful. Maybe not so much, but it's almost like everything has balanced out somewhat.
Well, class systems are different in every culture. I mean, our class system is based on economics, and you can move up or down based on your circumstances. But class systems in other cultures are completely different. Um, in India, the caste systems, which are supposedly outlawed but are still there, um, it's not very easy to move from one class to another. Uh, Officially, they will tell you there is no class system, but to the average person on the street, oh boy, yes, there is. Uh, Something that we refer to here in the US as middle class, we mean economically.
That's
You're
right.
not considered poor, you're not considered rich, you're in the middle. And that's the overwhelming majority of the country. But you just go over to the UK, middle class is something completely and entirely different.
Well, just as
And
an
it's not based on economics. But go
that's
ahead.
no, that's a great point. Just as a point of reference for people not from here, let's say, um, you could be on the street, and that whole middle class or class system is a financial economic one, that can't be seen. You'll have a rich dudes aren't compelled necessarily to have a fancy this or fancy that. They'll be walking in flip flops right next to a guy that's panhandling for coins. Um, Point is that we don't see it. You
Right,
don't hear it.
right.
You don't hear it in people's voices. You don't see it at all when out in the street. You could be standing to a guy in flip flops, and he's like a multi-billionaire, let's say, or what something there
Mhm.
about, and you don't see it out on your day to day. You do not see it. It's categorized only financially, and that's governmental stuff.
Right. Yeah, there was a book written back in the late 80s, early 90s called The Millionaire Next Door. And it basically chronicled uh, six people who had a net worth over $1 million, and what they did, how they lived. And it talked about these people specifically, but then they had also interviewed hundreds more people who had a net worth over $1 million, and how they lived, how they made their money, how they kept their money, what they did to stay financially secure. And the overwhelming majority of them were self-employed, and they just didn't spend money. They didn't drive Jaguars. They didn't drive the big Mercedes. The average vehicle that these stealth millionaires, they called them, was about 5 or 6 years old, and it was a mid-range priced car. You don't get rich and keep money by spending it. So
Yeah.
it's the people that were out there spending money on the $65 million homes and this, that, and the other, that all that means is you have bigger bills, you have bigger payments, and that's not how you keep wealth.
Yeah.
So it's just living within your means and putting it away. But that's, again, the American class system. I mean, you have people over in the UK who are middle class or upper class who are on the verge of starvation, and they basically make their living giving tours through their own home.
I've seen that.
They live in 3 or 4 rooms because they can't afford to heat the whole house. So they have land, they have the title, but they don't have an income. So it's a different system entirely. So
did you have this day in history lined up or no?
Well, I had a couple of things, but it turns out that, see, this is going live on April 2nd, so we'll have to put this in the context of what happened in April 2nd.
Right, Tuesday coming up.
Yes. April 2nd, 1964, the Beatles had their 4th UK #1 single with Can't Buy Me Love.
Oh, wow.
And it holds the record for the greatest number of advanced orders for a single in the UK. Still holds that record.
Can I add a little thing to that?
Go ahead.
The reason that occurred, and this is documented within the Beatles, world. You could look it up. Brian Epstein purchased, when that first release came out, purchased all throughout England, all the record stores everywhere. He purchased every single copy he could get his hands on so they could chart. And it worked when kids would come in, and they started pre-ordering and the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Looking at this stuff here, the Beach Boys recorded the single "I Get Around."
Oh, awesome.
On this day in 1964, and it became their first #1 hit in the summer of '64.
And it's an awesome song, I'll tell you what.
Yeah, it is. It is. This day in April 1970, Phil Spector completed the final editing and mixing for the Beatles' Let It Be album.
Oh, wow. That's kind of a funny thing, because you mentioned the Love Me Do. Was it Love Me Do?
It was Can't Buy Me Love.
Oh, the first, no. Okay, so the first one was Can't Buy Me Love. Okay.
Yeah, well, it was today. It was the 4th UK #1 hit for the Beatles, Can't Buy Me Love.
Okay, so that's the first one you were mentioning.
Right.
Okay, so then I'm going to have to correct myself. It was Love Me Do that they did that with, not Can't Buy Me Love. So correction on that. So it happened again. Well, they were fantastic. So I'm sure that backlog of sales had to occur every time they release a record, just about. And this one was Phil Spector.
Phil Spector completed the final editing and mixing for the Beatles' Let It Be album.
Awesome.
So,
Paul McCartney did not appreciate whatsoever Phil Spector's, which was brought in by John Lennon.
Really?
Phil Spector was, because by that time they were fighting an awful lot. There were financial issues. They were pretty much on the verge, if not broken up. By the time it came out, at least it was. They were, but an interesting factoid is that Paul McCartney was uber not happy with the mix, the way he mixed it, and he added sappy strings to let it be itself. He didn't appreciate that whatsoever,
Oh wow.
because that didn't exist in Paul McCartney's mind, and they couldn't get it together to do the mixing. So that's why they handed it off to Phil Spector, which I believe did a great job. It's the one that we all know. But
I
you're
like that album. I like that album a lot. That was one of the first albums of the Beatles I ever got.
well, years later, coming into our timeline within the 2000s,
Mhm.
after so many years, Paul McCartney took it, onto himself to actually go back and grab all the tracks and remix the album the way they had intended, or he had intended, and he called it "Let It Be Naked."
Huh.
So,
I'm gonna have to look for that. I've never heard of it.
so out there is a version of "Let It Be" called "Let It Be Naked," and it's quite different
Huh.
than what Phil Spector did.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd never heard any of that story, and I'm gonna have to look for "Let It Be Naked." I like odd Beatles records and cuts and what have you. I mean, I have a few of their early tunes in German.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of funny. Yeah. Um, let's see. The number one album, April 2nd, 1971, was Janis Joplin's "Pearl,"
Ooh.
which was released just after she died. And the number one single, "Me and Bobby McGee" by Janis Joplin.
Holy smoke! So 71, that was
Yep.
the number one single
Right.
that week.
That week. Yes. And the album was number one, "Pearl." Fast forward in 1977, Fleetwood Mac hit number one on the U.S. album charts with "Rumors."
Oh wow, that's a big deal.
That was a huge album. I think we've talked about it many times
Mhm.
before. That was one of like four albums you had to own when I was in high school around that time. 1977, I was 16 years old. You had to have Fleetwood Mac Rumors. You had to have Boston's debut album. You had to have Leonard Skinner Pronounced, and you had to have Frampton Comes Alive. If you didn't have those four albums, you were just wrong. I was almost a law.
Well, I'll tell you what, Rumors,
Mhm.
awesome album beginning to end,
Yep.
big time. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, kind of a weird one, kind of an odd one. 2nd of April, 1990, Eric Clapton was fined £300 by Walton on Thames Magistrate Courts after being booked for speeding at 105 miles an hour. He was also banned from driving for 3 months. So let's see. Oh yeah, 2nd of April, 1987. Buddy Rich died due to complications of a brain tumor.
Oh wow.
Probably one of the best drummers ever to live. So
I own a couple of his albums. He had like something called Big Band something and
right.
something or other, really good music.
And I think that's about it in old any of the older music here. There's a lot of newer stuff. Let's see. We'll see about okay, birthdays this 2nd of April, 1939, Marvin Gaye.
Okay.
2nd of April, 1941, Leon Russell.
Who's that?
You don't know who Leon Russell is?
Mm-mm. Not by the name.
Yeah, he was a singer and songwriter and played several instruments. He worked with Phil Spector, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, Glenn Campbell. Um, he played, oh my gosh, with the Byrds, Mr. Tambourine Man. He was just one of those all around. He played guitar, he played drums, he played everything. He was just one of those all around musicians who was always around. He did a few solo albums too, but he never really made it as big as maybe he should have been.
Okay.
But let's see. Emmylou Harris was born in 1947.
Who was she?
Emmylou Harris. She's a singer, songwriter, and musician who has played. She's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Country Music Hall of Fame. She's worked with like Bob Dylan, John Denver, Linda Ronstadt. I mean, there's a whole list. Mark Knopfler, Willie Nelson, Neil Young, a whole list of people that she has worked with and written songs for. So, well, that's about it as far as super famous birthdays and what have you. But just a little trip down rock and roll memory lane for
Sweet.
April 2nd.
Awesome. Well, there's some good stuff there. So,
Oh, yeah. But I knew the minute I bring up the Beatles, you and me were going to have a conversation about them because it seems to be one of our common things. You have delved a lot deeper into their biographies than I ever have. But I just sit back and enjoy the heck out of the music. But I will say one more thing. As we record this today on March 30th, it is, number one, it's Eric Clapton's birthday today.
oh wow. Yep, that's right.
And it's also the day I'm going to get the date wrong. It would have to be 1967. It would have to be 1967 that the photographer got all the Beatles together and they took the album art photos for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Oh, that's such a great cover and such a fantastic. If you look on Google and explore it a little bit, you can see the shots, the pictures from the side, or extra pictures where you see the cardboard cutouts of all the different characters, Muhammad Ali, just everybody, standing in the background. Heck, they even added, I think, like, did they add Hitler and stuff? I know they added like all sorts of.
Oh yeah, there were. I mean, yeah. See, it was today in 1967, and the photo session took place at Chelsea Manor Studios in London. Michael Cooper was the photographer. Then after the photo shoot was done, they went back to Abbey Road Studios and did a little bit more work on, with a little help from my friends, adding some guitars, bass, tambourine, and backing vocals.
Yeah, that's just a beautiful album. I'll say it. I've said it before, but I'll just say it. Sgt. Pepper's, by all accounts, and mentions from Paul McCartney and some of the other Beatles and the Beach Boys, was a reflection inspired by Pet Sounds,
right,
from the Beach Boys, which is mind-blowing.
Yep. And the jury is still out. Arguments go back and forth all the time, constantly, to this day, as to which of those two albums, Sgt. Pepper or Pet Sounds, was considered the first progressive rock album. Neither one of them wants to admit it, and they don't want the title, or they didn't anyway. There's only two more Beatles living. Neither one of them wanted that, because back then progressive rock was not the association with progressive jazz. They didn't want that association made, so they didn't like the name progressive rock. And so both bands just totally said, well, yeah, it must have been the other one, because they didn't want that hung on them.
Well, just to go a step further, the Beach Boys, Pet Sounds, and Brian Wilson was the one that got that thing together, actually. He's the one that got it together, because the other guys were not happy.
Yeah.
The record company was not happy. No one was happy that Pet Sounds was what Brian Wilson, the writer for the Beach Boys, main writer, like 99% the writer of the Beach Boys songs, started doing that. Nobody was happy, because it was such a departure from the, enjoying your summer vacation on the beach music, or driving down the highway music. But Brian Wilson was inspired by the Beatles, and the album was Rubber Soul that inspired him to create Pet Sounds.
Really?
Yeah, so that's another sort of thing.
Well, a lot of some of their best songs came from that album. And now I get it. They were trying to get away from the surfer music, and so it was a departure in that, because it wasn't talking about the convertible with the top down and the surfboards and the blondes and the bikinis. They were trying to I understand he was trying to get away from that surfer image and branch off into other things. But I still, to this day, don't understand the arguing and the infighting about the albums, because some of their best music came from that album.
Oh yeah,
Wouldn't it be nice, Sloop John B? I mean, come on. There's many, many more, obvious.
Caroline, no.
Yeah, but you know, I,
Another last bit about this whole sort of like Beatles and Beach Boys with those progressive, the first progressive and um the Beach Boy Pet Sounds album, going back to that Let It Be situation that I had mentioned, the Beach Boys Pet Sound album, another influence of Brian Wilson's that was quite like in your face actually, was that he was completely enamored with Phil Spector's wall of sound process in mixing, producing, recording music. And he reproduced, in fact, used the same musicians that Phil Spector would use. And it got around LA and around town that Brian Wilson was basically using Spector's, everybody's,
mm-hmm.
all of the musicians that he used for Pet Sounds, and in fact that was the case. So the person that Paul McCartney wasn't too happy with doing Let It Be, well, that's the same theme that Brian Wilson was trying to pick up on for Pet Sounds, which Paul McCartney loved to death.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, the politics of fame.
Isn't it like
yeah. So.
All right. Well, I think that we're good. What do you say?
Oh, I think we're more than good. We've done about an hour and a half, and the folks out there are probably getting tired, so we'll give them all a little bit of a break. I just personally wanted to say thanks to everybody over there in the chat who joined us here live on YouTube. Those of you who have stuck with us, it's always fun to flip back and forth through screens and see we've got some people over here, helping me, keeping me straight. They, especially a couple people over in the UK that were feeding me lines on the on some of the intricacies, shall we say, of the UK. And I don't know. This is fun. We don't know when we're going to go live on YouTube. We just go. We push the button. When Eloy and I can get it together, we push the button, and here we are. So thanks for joining us. I really do appreciate it. So for everybody else out there, we release a new episode of Trampled Underfoot every Tuesday morning. When does it go live, Eloy?
Tuesdays at 5 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. And you can catch up on that every week. And on our actual website, did you mention our website?
I haven't mentioned it yet. Go for it.
So we have a website where you can catch up on past episodes as well. Just go to trampledunderfootpodcast.com and click that Wayback Machine button, and it'll show you all the past episodes. And so, yeah, we appreciate you guys hanging. If you guys have any questions, any comments, did we get things wrong, right, good, bad, let us know. Leave us a comment, maybe show suggestions as well, and we definitely would love to address those.
Yeah, if you've got a topic that you think we haven't covered, or maybe that we covered too much and you don't want to hear about it anymore, let us know. We're grown-ups. We can take it. I also want to mention that TrampledUnderfootPodcast.com is sponsored by Harneal Media. Steve Nealon over at Harneal Media works his tail off. The webmaster to the stars. He specializes in websites and web hosting for makers in the maker community. But even if you don't make anything, check him out, harnealmedia.com. Steve will take care of you.
All right. Have a good night, guys.
Take care.